Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today's new story is He Defeated an Army with 300 Men. The Rise and Fall of Gideon. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
For centuries, Gideon has been remembered as the fearless leader who defeated an army with only 300 men. It is one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible. But what if that is only part of the story? What if Gideon was not the confident hero many people imagine? When we first meet him, he is not standing on a battlefield. He is hiding. He is afraid. He is questioning God. And even after achieving one of the most astonishing victories in biblical history, his story does not end the way most people expect. Behind the miracle of the 300 lies a far more complex and human journey, a story of fear, doubt, faith, success, failure, and the dangerous legacy that followed. To understand Gideon, we must go beyond the children's version of the story and step into the harsh realities of ancient Israel during one of its darkest periods. Who was Gideon really? Why did God choose him? And what lessons have generations of readers often missed? This is the complete story of Gideon. To understand the story of Gideon, we must begin long before Gideon himself appears. His story did not emerge in a time of national strength, political stability, or spiritual faithfulness. Instead, it unfolded during one of the most turbulent and chaotic periods in Israel's history, a period known as the era of the Judges. This was the generation that came after the great conquests led by Joshua. The Israelites had entered the Promised Land. Many of their enemies had been defeated, and the long journey from Egypt seemed finally complete. Yet, beneath the surface, a dangerous problem was growing. The people possessed the land, but they had not fully embraced the covenant responsibilities that came with it. The Book of Judges describes a recurring pattern that would define this entire era. Modern scholars often call it the Judges cycle. The pattern begins with Israel turning away from the God who had delivered them. Instead of remaining faithful to the covenant established at Sinai, many Israelites gradually adopted the religious practices of the surrounding Canaanite cultures. They worshipped local deities such as Baal and Asherah, gods associated with fertility, agriculture, rain, and prosperity. This shift was not merely a change in religious preference. In the biblical worldview, it represented a rejection of the covenant relationship that defined Israel's identity as a people. Once the nation drifted into idolatry, the next stage of the cycle would begin. According to the biblical narrative, God would allow neighboring nations to oppress Israel. These foreign powers became instruments of judgment, exposing the consequences of Israel's spiritual compromise. The suffering that followed would eventually drive the people to desperation. In their distress, they would cry out to God for deliverance. Then God would raise up a judge, a leader empowered to rescue the nation and restore stability. For a time, peace would return. Yet, after the judge died, the cycle would begin again, often becoming even worse than before. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the Book of Judges and forms the backdrop for every major story in the book. Understanding this cycle is essential, because Gideon's story is not primarily about an individual hero. It is about a nation trapped in a repeating crisis of faith, disobedience, suffering, and temporary restoration. The era itself was politically fragmented. Unlike later periods under kings such as Saul, David, or Solomon, Israel had no centralized government. There was no permanent national army. There was no royal court. There was no unified political authority capable of coordinating the tribes into a single nation. Instead, Israel existed as a loose confederation of tribes spread across different regions. Local leaders dealt with local problems, and tribal interests often outweighed national unity. This lack of cohesion made Israel vulnerable to both external threats and internal conflicts. One of the most important statements in the Book of Judges appears near its conclusion. The author repeatedly observes that in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This statement serves as more than a political observation. It functions as a theological diagnosis of the nation's condition. The problem was not merely the absence of a human king. The deeper issue was that the people had ceased recognizing God's authority over their lives. Their moral compass became increasingly shaped by personal desires, local customs, and cultural pressures rather than covenant obedience. Historical and archaeological studies of the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age provide important context for this period. Ancient Canaan was a complex environment filled with competing city-states, tribal groups, trade routes, and shifting alliances. The Israelites were surrounded by cultures whose religious practices often revolved around agricultural fertility and regional deities. For communities dependent upon rainfall and successful harvests, the temptation to adopt these local religious systems was powerful. From a historical perspective, the struggle described in Judges reflects the challenge of maintaining a distinct national and religious identity within a highly diverse and competitive environment. Theologically, however, the biblical authors interpret these events through a covenant framework. They argue that Israel's greatest threat was never military weakness alone. It was spiritual unfaithfulness. By the time Gideon's story begins in Judges chapter 6, this cycle has already repeated multiple times. The nation is exhausted. The promises of peace seem temporary. Each generation appears to repeat the mistakes of the one before it. The people know the stories of the Exodus. They know the miracles associated with Moses and Joshua. Yet, knowledge of the past has not produced lasting obedience in the present. This tension creates the perfect setting for the arrival of Gideon. What makes Gideon's story remarkable is not simply that he will defeat an enemy army. Many leaders in the ancient world won military victories. What makes his story remarkable is that it emerges from a society that is spiritually fractured, politically divided, and emotionally worn down by repeated failure. The crisis facing Israel is deeper than economics, deeper than warfare, and deeper than foreign oppression. It is a crisis of identity. The nation no longer clearly understands who it is, whom it serves, or why it exists. As we move forward, it is important to remember that Gideon enters the story not as a celebrated warrior waiting for his opportunity. He enters it as a product of this troubled generation. He will carry the same fears, questions, and weaknesses that characterize the society around him. And it is precisely in this atmosphere of uncertainty and decline that one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible begins. By the time the story of Gideon begins, Israel was not merely experiencing political instability or occasional border conflicts. The nation was living under a form of oppression that touched nearly every aspect of daily life. According to Judges chapter 6, the Israelites had once again done what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and as a result, they found themselves under the domination of the Midianites for 7 years. To modern readers, 7 years may sound like a manageable period of hardship. In the ancient world, however, 7 consecutive years of economic devastation could cripple entire communities and permanently alter the future of a generation. What makes the Midianite oppression unique in the Book of Judges is that it was not primarily an occupation in the traditional sense. The Midianites did not establish a centralized government over Israel. They did not build administrative centers or attempt to integrate Israel into a larger empire. Instead, their strategy resembled a recurring cycle of organized economic destruction. Every year, when the Israelites planted their crops and prepared for harvest. The Midianites would arrive in massive numbers alongside allied groups such as the Amalekites and various peoples from the eastern deserts. They would sweep across the land like a devastating wave, consuming resources, seizing livestock, and destroying the food supply before the Israelites could benefit from their labor. The biblical text uses vivid language to describe these invasions. The enemy forces are compared to swarms of locusts, emphasizing both their overwhelming numbers and their destructive impact. This imagery would have resonated deeply with an agricultural society. A locust invasion could strip an entire region bare, leaving behind famine, poverty, and despair. The comparison suggests that the Midianites functioned as a human disaster, repeatedly undoing the work of Israel's farmers and shepherds. Unlike a single military defeat, this was a crisis that returned year after year, destroying hope as effectively as it destroyed crops. To appreciate the severity of the situation, it is important to understand the economic realities of the ancient Near East. Most families depended directly on agriculture and livestock for survival. There were no modern supply chains, no food reserves capable of supporting entire populations for extended periods, and no government programs designed to alleviate widespread poverty. A failed harvest often meant hunger. Multiple failed harvests could mean starvation. When the Midianites repeatedly targeted Israel's food production, they attacked the very foundation of society. Families that had spent months cultivating fields would watch their work vanish in a matter of days. Communities that relied upon herds and flocks for income and survival would see those resources carried away by raiders. Over time, fear became a permanent feature of everyday life. Judges chapter 6 tells us that many Israelites fled into mountains, caves, and strongholds. These were not strategic military fortifications in the modern sense. They were places of refuge, locations where ordinary people attempted to hide themselves and whatever resources they could preserve. Imagine the psychological toll of abandoning your home, storing food in secret locations, and constantly wondering whether another raid was coming. This was not simply economic hardship. It was a society living under chronic insecurity. Historically, the Midianites were a semi-nomadic people associated with regions east and south of Israel. They appear at various points throughout the Old Testament and were familiar participants in the political landscape of the ancient Near East. Their mobility gave them significant advantages. Unlike settled agricultural communities, nomadic groups could move rapidly across large territories. They often possessed extensive knowledge of trade routes, desert travel, and seasonal migration patterns. In the case of Judges 6, this mobility allowed the Midianites to launch highly effective raids against communities that depended upon fixed agricultural cycles. Many scholars have noted that the biblical description resembles forms of economic warfare seen throughout history. Rather than conquering territory permanently, the objective was to weaken an opponent by targeting resources, disrupting production, and maintaining a constant state of vulnerability. Whether viewed through a theological lens or a historical one, the result was the same. Israel became impoverished. The people could no longer protect the fruit of their labor. Their confidence collapsed alongside their economy. Yet the biblical author is careful to frame this crisis as more than a military or economic problem. From the perspective of the Book of Judges, the Midianite oppression represents a symptom of a deeper spiritual condition. Earlier chapters established the recurring cycle that defined this era. Israel abandoned its covenant relationship with God. Oppression followed. Distress increased. Eventually, the people cried out for deliverance. That pattern now reaches another critical turning point. After 7 years of suffering, the Israelites finally cry out to the Lord. Interestingly, before God raises a deliverer, He first sends a prophet. This detail is often overlooked because readers are eager to reach Gideon's story. Yet it is significant. The prophet reminds the people of their history. He recalls God's deliverance from Egypt, his faithfulness throughout previous generations, and his commands regarding covenant loyalty. The message is clear. Israel's greatest problem is not Midian. Midian is only the visible manifestation of a deeper spiritual crisis. Before the nation can understand deliverance, it must first understand why it needs deliverance. This moment creates the tension that drives the narrative forward. Israel is desperate. The enemy appears unstoppable. The economy has been shattered. Fear dominates daily life. Yet, the biblical narrative insists that the story is not ultimately about Midian's strength. It is about what God intends to do in the midst of Israel's weakness, and in one of the most unexpected developments in the entire book of Judges. The future deliverer is not found among military leaders, tribal chiefs, or celebrated warriors. He is hiding in a place where no one would expect a hero to be found. The future deliverer of Israel does not enter the biblical story the way most heroes do. There is no dramatic battlefield introduction. There is no display of courage, strength, or leadership. In fact, the first image we encounter is almost the complete opposite. Gideon is hiding. As Judges chapter 6 opens, Israel remains trapped under the crushing oppression of Midian. The harvest season has become a time of fear rather than celebration. Farmers cannot openly process their grain because enemy raiders may appear at any moment. Every act of survival requires caution. Every successful harvest risks attracting unwanted attention. It is within this atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty that Gideon first appears. The text tells us that he is threshing wheat in a winepress to hide it from the Midianites. To modern readers, this detail may seem insignificant, but to the original audience it would have been striking. Wheat was normally threshed in open areas where the wind could separate grain from chaff. A winepress, by contrast, was typically a lower, enclosed space carved into rock and designed for crushing grapes. It was not an efficient place to process wheat. Gideon's choice reveals the reality of Israel's situation. He is sacrificing efficiency for secrecy. He is working in a place designed to avoid detection. This is not the behavior of a confident military leader preparing to save a nation. It is the behavior of a man trying to survive another season under oppression. Yet this scene is important because it immediately challenges many assumptions readers bring to the story. Gideon is often remembered as the commander of the famous 300. He is celebrated as a symbol of faith and victory. But the biblical narrative introduces him as a fearful and cautious individual. This honesty is one of the remarkable features of the Book of Judges. The text does not sanitize its heroes. It presents them as complex human beings whose weaknesses are visible from the very beginning. Gideon's fear is not hidden. It is placed at the center of the story. The next event is even more surprising. While Gideon is working in the winepress, the angel of the Lord appears and sits beneath an oak tree near Ophrah. The exact identity of this figure has been debated for centuries. Some scholars view the angel of the Lord as a special divine messenger acting on God's behalf. Others point to passages where the angel appears to speak with divine authority and suggest a more mysterious manifestation of God's presence. Regardless of one's theological interpretation, the narrative presents this encounter as a direct divine intervention into Israel's crisis. What follows is one of the most famous greetings in the entire Bible. The angel says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." At first glance, the statement seems almost ironic. Nothing in the scene suggests that Gideon is a mighty warrior. He is not leading troops. He is not defeating enemies. He is hiding in a winepress. This tension is intentional. The statement forces readers to ask an important question. Is the angel describing who Gideon currently is, or who he will become. Throughout Scripture, divine callings often involve this kind of paradox. God sees possibilities that others cannot see. He speaks about future realities before they become visible in the present. Yet Gideon's response reveals that he does not see himself the way the angel sees him. Instead of expressing confidence or excitement, he immediately raises questions. His first concern is not his own role. It is the condition of Israel. If the Lord is truly with us, he asks, why has all this happened to us? Where are the miracles our ancestors told us about? Why does it seem as though God has abandoned his people? These are not the words of an arrogant man. They are the words of someone who has lived through years of disappointment and suffering. Gideon's questions reflect the experience of an entire generation. They know the stories of the Exodus. They know about the crossing of the Red Sea. They know about God's mighty acts in the past. But their present reality appears very different. The contrast between historical memory and present suffering has created confusion. Gideon voices what many Israelites were probably thinking, but had never openly expressed. This moment also reveals something important about biblical faith. The narrative does not condemn Gideon simply for asking difficult questions. In many ancient religious systems, questioning divine actions could be seen as an act of rebellion. Yet, throughout the Bible, figures such as Moses, Job, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, and even the psalmists bring their confusion before God. Gideon's questions emerge from a desire to understand, not from a desire to reject. He is wrestling with the apparent contradiction between God's promises and Israel's circumstances. The angel's response shifts the conversation dramatically. Rather than offering a detailed explanation for Israel's suffering, God commissions Gideon for a mission. Go in the strength you have, and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Once again, Gideon responds with hesitation. He points to his family background. His clan, he explains, is the weakest in Manasseh, and he is the least important member of his father's household. In the ancient world, social standing mattered enormously. Leadership often emerged from powerful families, wealthy clans, or influential tribal networks. Gideon sees none of those advantages in himself. From his perspective, he is an unlikely candidate for national leadership. Yet, this is precisely the point. The biblical narrative repeatedly emphasizes that God's choice does not depend upon conventional measures of status, strength, or influence. The focus remains not on Gideon's qualifications, but on God's presence. The promise is simple: I will be with you. As the conversation unfolds, the story begins to reveal one of its central themes. The coming deliverance of Israel will not be explained by military power, political connections, or human greatness. The man standing at the center of the story is fearful, uncertain, and convinced of his own inadequacy. Yet, it is precisely in this unlikely figure that God chooses to begin his work. The hero of the story is not introduced as a hero at all. He is introduced as a man who cannot yet imagine becoming the person God is calling him to be. The conversation between Gideon and the angel of the Lord does not end with Gideon receiving his commission. In many biblical stories, a divine calling is followed by immediate obedience. Gideon's story is different. The deeper we move into the narrative, the more we discover that Gideon is struggling with something far more profound than fear of the Midianites. He is struggling to understand whether God can truly be trusted. This distinction is important because it reveals one of the central tensions of the entire story. Gideon's problem is not simple unbelief. It is the conflict between what he has heard about God and what he sees in the world around him. From Gideon's perspective, the evidence appears contradictory. He has grown up hearing stories about God's power, like every Israelite. He would have known the traditions of the Exodus. He would have heard about Moses confronting Pharaoh, the plagues that struck Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, and the miraculous provision in the wilderness. These stories formed the foundation of Israel's national identity. Yet, when Gideon looks around, he sees none of that power. He sees a nation hiding in caves. He sees families losing their harvests. He sees fear replacing confidence and poverty replacing prosperity. The God of the stories seems very distant from the reality of his generation. This explains why Gideon's first response to the angel's greeting is not celebration, but questioning. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about? These questions are among the most honest in the entire book of Judges. They expose the emotional and spiritual exhaustion of a people who have endured years of suffering. Modern readers often assume that biblical heroes possessed unwavering certainty. The text repeatedly challenges that assumption. Gideon is not portrayed as a man overflowing with confidence. He is portrayed as a man trying to make sense of apparent silence. From a literary perspective, these questions also serve another purpose. They allow the narrator to address the concerns of the audience. Why has Israel suffered so severely? Has God abandoned his people? Have the covenant promise failed? The answer given by the biblical narrative is not that God has disappeared. Rather, the nation has broken its covenant relationship with him. Earlier, in Judges chapter 6, the unnamed prophet reminded Israel that their crisis was connected to their disobedience and idolatry. Yet Gideon appears unaware of the full picture. Like many people experiencing hardship, he focuses on the visible suffering without fully understanding the deeper causes behind it. Nevertheless, what is remarkable is that God does not reject Gideon for asking these questions. There is no rebuke for his confusion. Instead, God patiently continues the conversation. This detail has significant theological implications. Throughout Scripture, there is a difference between defiant unbelief and honest struggle. Gideon belongs to the second category. He is not mocking God. He is searching for understanding. His questions emerge from disappointment, not rebellion. In many ways, his experience mirrors that of countless believers throughout history who have wrestled with suffering, unanswered prayers, and the apparent absence of divine intervention. Yet Gideon's doubts do not disappear after receiving God's commission. In fact, they intensify. When God tells him that he will save Israel from Midian, Gideon immediately points to his own limitations. His clan is the weakest in Manasseh. He is the least important member of his family. These statements reveal how deeply insecurity has shaped his identity. Years of oppression have not only weakened Israel economically, they have also diminished the confidence of its people. Gideon does not see himself as a leader because nothing in his experience suggests that he should. Once again, God does not respond by highlighting Gideon's strengths. Instead, he redirects the focus toward his own presence. The promise remains the same: I will be with you. Yet even this assurance is not enough for Gideon. He wants confirmation that the mysterious figure speaking to him truly represents God. This request leads to one of the most fascinating scenes in the narrative. Gideon asks the visitor to remain while he prepares an offering. He returns with meat, unleavened bread, and broth, placing them before the angel. What happens next transforms the encounter. Following the angel's instructions, Gideon sets the food upon a rock. The angel touches the offering with the tip of his staff. Immediately fire springs from the rock and consumes the entire sacrifice. Then the angel disappears from sight. To the ancient audience, this event would have carried enormous significance. Fire from heaven often functioned as a sign of divine acceptance and presence. Similar imagery appears elsewhere in the Old Testament during pivotal moments of worship and covenant affirmation. The miracle confirms that Gideon is not speaking to an ordinary traveler. He has encountered a messenger of divine authority. Yet instead of bringing immediate comfort, the realization terrifies him. Gideon suddenly understands the seriousness of what has happened. He cries out in fear because he believes he has seen the angel of the Lord face to face. Within the worldview of ancient Israel, direct encounters with the divine were often associated with mortal danger. God's holiness was not viewed casually. To stand in his presence was an overwhelming experience. Gideon fears that he will die once again. However, God responds with reassurance rather than judgment. Peace. Do not be afraid. You are not going to die. These words mark an important turning point in the story. For the first time, Gideon moves from questioning God's presence to experiencing it personally. The stories he had heard from previous generations are no longer distant memories. The God of the Exodus has entered his own life. In response, Gideon builds an altar and names it "The Lord is Peace." This name is deeply significant. Israel remains under Midianite oppression. The enemy has not yet been defeated. Nothing has changed politically or militarily. Yet, Gideon has discovered something that precedes external deliverance. Before God transforms the nation, he begins by transforming the heart of the man he has called. The chapter closes with a subtle but powerful tension. Gideon now knows that God has spoken to him. He has received supernatural confirmation. He has experienced divine reassurance. Yet the difficult task still lies ahead. Knowing God's will and carrying it out are not the same thing. The real test of Gideon's faith is about to begin, and surprisingly, his first battle will not be against Midian at all. At this point in the story, many readers expect Gideon's next assignment to involve military preparation. After all, God has just called him to save Israel from the Midianites. The nation is suffering under foreign oppression. Enemy armies dominate the land. Logic would suggest that Gideon should begin gathering soldiers, planning strategies, and preparing for war. Instead, God gives him a completely different mission. Before Gideon can confront Midian, he must confront something much closer to home. His first battle will not be against a foreign enemy. It will be against the spiritual corruption that has taken root within his own community. This unexpected command reveals one of the most important themes in the entire book of Judges. From the biblical perspective, Israel's greatest problem is not military weakness. It is covenant unfaithfulness. The oppression of Midian is only the symptom. Idolatry is the disease. During the night, God instructs Gideon to take one of his father's bulls and tear down the altar of Baal that belongs to his family. He is also commanded to cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it and use the wood to build an altar to the Lord. Upon that altar he is to offer a sacrifice. To modern readers, this may appear to be a relatively simple act. In the ancient world, however, it was an act loaded with enormous religious, social, and political consequences. The altar of Baal was not merely a private object. It represented the spiritual identity of the local community. Baal worship was widespread throughout Canaan and was often associated with fertility, agricultural success, rainfall, and prosperity. For farmers facing repeated crop failures and economic devastation, the temptation to seek help from fertility deities would have been particularly strong. The presence of an altar and Asherah pole within Gideon's own family property suggests how deeply these practices had penetrated Israelite society. The covenant people of Yahweh had gradually adopted the religious customs of the surrounding cultures. This is what makes God's command so significant. Before Israel can be delivered from external oppression, its internal allegiance must be addressed. Gideon now faces a dilemma. He has received clear instructions from God, but obeying them could provoke a dangerous reaction. The altar belongs to his father's household. The local population almost certainly supports its existence. Destroying it would be seen not only as an act of religious defiance, but also as an attack against community traditions. The risks are real. Gideon understands this. The text tells us that he takes 10 servants and carries out the mission at night, because he is afraid of his family and the men of the town. This detail is important because it continues a pattern already established in the narrative. Gideon is still afraid. The story does not suddenly transform him into a fearless hero. Even after encountering the angel of the Lord and witnessing a supernatural sign, he remains cautious. Some readers have criticized Gideon for acting at night rather than during the day, yet the biblical text does not explicitly condemn him for this decision. Instead, it presents a more nuanced picture. Gideon may be afraid, but he obeys. His courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to act despite fear. During the night, the altar of Baal is demolished. The Asherah pole is cut down. A new altar dedicated to the Lord is built. The sacrifice is offered exactly as God commanded. By morning, the town awakens to a shocking sight. The center of local worship has been destroyed. The reaction is immediate and intense. The men of the town investigate and quickly discover that Gideon is responsible. Their response reveals just how deeply idolatry has taken hold within Israel. Instead of celebrating the restoration of covenant worship, they demand Gideon's execution. Bring him out, they insist, so that he may die. The irony is striking. The covenant people are prepared to kill a man for destroying an idol. The spiritual confusion of Israel has become so severe that loyalty to Baal now appears stronger than loyalty to the God who delivered them from Egypt. At this critical moment, an unexpected figure steps forward. Gideon's father, Joash, addresses the angry crowd. His response becomes one of the most memorable speeches in the narrative. He asks a simple but devastating question. Will you contend for Baal? Will you save him? If Baal is truly a god, let him defend himself because someone has broken down his altar. The logic is impossible to ignore. If Baal possesses genuine divine power, he should not require human beings to protect him. He should be capable of responding on his own. Joash exposes the weakness hidden beneath the appearance of religious devotion. The crowd can threaten Gideon, but Baal himself remains silent. No judgment falls from heaven. No supernatural retaliation occurs. The idol cannot defend its altar because it possesses no power to do so. This moment serves as a public demonstration of the contrast between the living God and the powerless gods of the nations. The outcome is remarkable. Gideon is spared, and from that day forward, he receives a new name. He is called Jerubbaal, which can be understood as meaning, "Let Baal contend against him," or "Let Baal defend himself." The name functions as a permanent reminder of the event. Every time it is spoken, it recalls the challenge issued to Baal and the complete absence of any response. Throughout the remainder of Gideon's story, this name carries symbolic significance. It represents the moment when the conflict between covenant faithfulness and idolatry became visible to the entire community. From a broader theological perspective, this episode reveals why God assigned this mission before any military campaign. The true battle for Israel's future is not ultimately against Midian. It is against divided loyalties. A nation cannot seek deliverance from God while simultaneously placing its trust in rival deities. Before Gideon can lead Israel into physical freedom, he must participate in a process of spiritual confrontation. This lesson extends far beyond the immediate historical context. The narrative suggests that external crises often expose deeper internal problems. The enemy occupying the land is dangerous, but the false gods occupying the hearts of the people are even more dangerous. By tearing down Baal's altar, Gideon has completed the first stage of his calling, yet the larger challenge still remains. The Midianites continue to dominate the land. Their armies are gathering. A national crisis is approaching, and for the first time in the story, Gideon is beginning to emerge from the shadows. The fearful man who once hid in a wine press has taken a public stand. The question now is whether he will be ready for the far greater test that lies ahead. The destruction of Baal's altar marked a turning point in Gideon's life, but it did not end Israel's crisis. The Midianites were still there. The Amalekites were still there. The vast coalition of eastern tribes that had terrorized Israel for years remained a powerful threat. If anything, the situation was becoming more dangerous. Gideon's public act of obedience had challenged idolatry within Israel. But now the nation faced the external enemy that had brought years of suffering and humiliation. The stage was being set for one of the most famous military confrontations in biblical history. Yet before the battle could begin, Gideon would once again reveal the uncertainty that had characterized his journey from the very beginning. This chapter is often remembered because of the famous story of the fleece, but to understand its true meaning, we must first examine the events surrounding it. Judges chapter 6 tells us that the Midianites, Amalekites, and various eastern peoples gathered together and crossed into the valley of Jezreel. This was not a minor raiding party. It was a massive military coalition. The valley of Jezreel was one of the most strategically important regions in ancient Israel. Its fertile land and key transportation routes made it a natural location for military campaigns. The arrival of such a large enemy force signaled that another devastating invasion was underway. Israel once again stood on the brink of disaster. At this crucial moment, the narrative introduces an important detail. The Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. Different English translations express this idea in slightly different ways. But the imagery is powerful. Rather than Gideon simply receiving strength, the text portrays him as being enveloped by divine empowerment. Throughout the Old Testament, the Spirit's coming upon a leader often marks the beginning of a special mission. In Gideon's case, it signifies that God is actively preparing him for the role he has been called to fulfill. The fearful farmer hiding in a winepress is beginning to step into a larger responsibility. Empowered by the Spirit, Gideon blows a trumpet. In the ancient world, the trumpet was not merely a musical instrument. It served as a signal for mobilization, gathering warriors and calling communities to action. Members of the clan of Abiezer rally behind him. Soon, messages spread throughout Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Men begin gathering for war. For the first time, Gideon is acting publicly as a leader. The transformation is significant. Earlier chapters showed him questioning, hesitating, and struggling with fear. Now he is organizing a military response against one of the most powerful threats Israel has faced in years. Yet, despite these encouraging developments, Gideon's inner struggle has not completely disappeared. This is where the story of the fleece enters the narrative. Few episodes in the Book of Judges have generated more discussion among theologians, pastors, and biblical scholars. For many modern Christians, putting out a fleece has become a common expression referring to seeking guidance from God through signs or special circumstances. However, the actual story is often more complex than popular interpretations suggest. Gideon approaches God with a request. He says that if God truly intends to save Israel through him, he would like confirmation. He places a wool fleece on the threshing floor and asks that dew appear only on the fleece, while the surrounding ground remains dry. The next morning, Gideon discovers exactly what he requested. The fleece is soaked with dew. In fact, there is enough moisture to wring out an entire bowl of water. At first glance, this might seem like the end of the matter. Gideon asked for a sign. God provided it. Yet Gideon is still not satisfied. He asks for a second sign, this time reversing the conditions. He requests that the fleece remain dry, while the ground around it becomes covered with dew. Once again, God grants the request. The following morning, the fleece is dry, while dew covers the surrounding ground. Why does Gideon ask for these signs? The answer is not as simple as many assume. Some readers interpret the fleece episode as an example of strong faith. Others see it as evidence of persistent doubt. Many scholars suggest that the truth lies somewhere in between. By this point in the story, Gideon has already received multiple confirmations. He has spoken with the angel of the Lord. He has witnessed the miraculous consumption of his sacrifice. He has obeyed God's command regarding Baal's altar. He has experienced the empowerment of God's Spirit. From this perspective, the fleece may indicate that Gideon is still struggling to fully trust what he already knows. Yet the narrative does not portray God as angry or impatient. Instead, God responds with remarkable patience. This aspect of the story is often overlooked. The focus is not merely on Gideon's uncertainty. It is also on God's willingness to meet him in the midst of that uncertainty. The relationship between divine calling and human weakness remains one of the major themes of Gideon's story. Another important observation concerns the historical context. Dew played a vital role in the agricultural life of ancient Israel, particularly during dry seasons. Gideon's request involved ordinary elements of daily experience, making the signs both accessible and meaningful. He was not asking for a spectacular cosmic event visible to the entire nation. He was asking for confirmation through something directly connected to the world he knew as a farmer. The signs addressed his personal struggle, rather than serving as public demonstrations. This distinction matters because the narrative is less concerned with establishing a general method for decision-making, and more concerned with revealing Gideon's internal journey. The story is not primarily teaching readers how to discover God's will. It is showing how God patiently develops the faith of a reluctant deliverer. Throughout Scripture, many leaders experience moments of hesitation before major assignments. Moses questioned his ability to speak. Jeremiah doubted his qualifications because of his youth. Even figures such as Elijah experienced periods of fear and discouragement. Gideon belongs within this broader biblical pattern. He is not an extraordinary hero who never struggles. He is an ordinary person being shaped for an extraordinary task. As the chapter draws to a close, the tension continues to build. The enemy armies remain camped in the valley of Jezreel. Thousands of Israelite warriors have gathered in response to Gideon's call. The signs have been given. The confirmations have been received. The moment of decision is approaching. Yet an even greater surprise awaits. Just when it appears that Israel is finally assembling a force capable of challenging Midian, God is about to make a decision that seems completely irrational from a military perspective. Instead of increasing Gideon's army, he will begin reducing it. And in doing so, he will transform the coming battle into a lesson that Israel will never forget. As Gideon looked across the growing ranks of Israel's army, he may have felt something he had not experienced in a long time: hope. For years, the Midianites had dominated the land with seemingly unstoppable force. Entire communities had lived in fear. Crops had been destroyed. Families had hidden in caves and mountain strongholds. Now, for the first time, a significant military response was taking shape. Men from multiple tribes had answered Gideon's call. According to the biblical account, approximately 32,000 warriors gathered to face the enemy. Although this force was still smaller than the vast coalition camped in the valley of Jezreel, it represented a remarkable achievement for a nation that had spent years under oppression. From a human perspective, Israel finally appeared to have a chance. Yet what happens next is one of the most surprising moments in the entire Bible. Instead of encouraging Gideon to strengthen his army, God tells him that the army is too large. The statement sounds almost absurd. Israel is facing a numerically superior enemy. The Midianites and their allies are described later as covering the valley like swarms of locusts. Their camels are said to be as countless as the sand on the seashore. Every conventional military calculation would suggest the need for more soldiers, not fewer. But God's concern is not military mathematics. His concern is something deeper. The Lord tells Gideon that if Israel wins with such a force, the people may conclude that they achieved victory through their own strength. They may claim credit for a deliverance that belongs to God. This explanation reveals the central issue. The coming battle is not merely about defeating Midian. It is about teaching Israel a lesson regarding the source of its security and success. Throughout the Book of Judges, one recurring problem has been Israel's tendency to forget its dependence upon God. When times are difficult, the people cry out for help. When deliverance comes, they often drift back toward self-reliance and spiritual compromise. The reduction of the army is designed to eliminate any possibility of misunderstanding. If victory occurs, there will be no reasonable explanation apart from divine intervention. The first reduction begins with a simple announcement. Gideon is instructed to tell the troops that anyone who is afraid may leave and return home. This command reflects an earlier principle found in Israelite law, where fearful soldiers could be excused from battle. The result is astonishing. 22,000 men depart immediately. Only 10,000 remain. Imagine the scene. Nearly 70% of the army walks away before the battle even begins. For Gideon, this must have been a shocking moment. The force he worked so hard to assemble has been drastically reduced in a matter of minutes. Yet God is not finished. Even after the departure of the fearful soldiers, the Lord declares that the army is still too large. Gideon is instructed to bring the remaining men down to the water, where another selection process will take place. Here, we encounter one of the most debated passages in Gideon's story. The men are observed while drinking water. Some kneel and drink directly from the stream. Others bring water to their mouths with their hands. The text reports that only 300 men lap water with their hands, while the rest kneel down to drink. God tells Gideon that these 300 men will form the final force. The remaining 9,700 are sent home. For centuries, interpreters have proposed various explanations for this test. Some suggest that the men who used their hands remained more alert and vigilant. Others argue that the distinction may reflect discipline or readiness. However, many modern scholars caution against reading too much into the details. The biblical text itself does not explicitly explain why one group was chosen over the other. The emphasis appears to fall less on the men's qualities and more on the dramatic reduction itself. The purpose is not necessarily to identify elite warriors. The purpose is to create an impossible situation from a human perspective. By the end of the process, Gideon's army has shrunk from 32,000 men to only 300. Numerically speaking, the odds are now overwhelming. Any realistic military strategist would view such a force as hopelessly inadequate against a vast enemy coalition. This is precisely the point. God is intentionally removing every source of human confidence. The coming victory must not be attributed to superior numbers, better training, or stronger leadership. It must point beyond human capability. The symbolism of the number 300 has fascinated readers for centuries. Yet, it is important to remember that the biblical narrative does not celebrate the 300 because they are extraordinary heroes. In many retellings, the focus shifts toward the courage and skill of these men. While courage certainly plays a role, the text consistently directs attention elsewhere. The central figure is not the army, it is God. the 300 become instruments through which a larger lesson is revealed. This distinction is crucial because it protects the story from being reduced to a simple motivational tale about overcoming impossible odds. The biblical message is more complex. The story is not teaching that small groups always defeat larger groups through determination alone. Rather, it explores the relationship between divine power and human weakness. Historically speaking, ancient warfare often depended heavily upon numbers, logistics, and resources. Larger armies generally enjoyed significant advantages. The reduction of Gideon's force would have appeared reckless to both allies and enemies. This makes the narrative particularly striking. The God of Israel deliberately rejects the strategies that most military leaders would consider essential. The result is a dramatic reversal of expectations. Throughout Scripture, similar patterns emerge repeatedly. Abraham and Sarah receive promises despite their old age. Moses confronts Pharaoh, despite his reluctance and insecurity. David faces Goliath despite overwhelming disadvantages. In each case, human weakness becomes the stage upon which divine power is displayed. Gideon's story now joins that larger biblical pattern. Yet, it is important not to overlook Gideon's perspective. We know from previous chapters that he is not naturally confident. He has questioned God. He has requested signs. He has struggled with fear. Now, after finally gathering an army capable of inspiring hope, he watches almost all of it disappear. The test is not only for Israel, it is also for Gideon himself. Will he trust God's promise when every visible source of security has been removed? As evening approaches, the 300 remain. The larger army is gone. The Midianite camp still fills the valley below. The enemy appears stronger than ever. Yet according to the biblical narrative, the decisive factor has never been the size of the army. The decisive factor is whether Gideon and Israel are willing to trust the God who called them. Soon, that trust will face its greatest challenge. For despite all the signs and confirmations already given, Gideon still carries fear within him, and before the battle begins, God is about to provide one final reassurance in the most unexpected way imaginable. By the end of the previous chapter, Gideon found himself standing in one of the most difficult positions imaginable. The army that had once numbered 32,000 had been reduced to only 300 men. Every conventional advantage had disappeared. The Midianites still occupied the valley below in overwhelming numbers. The darkness of night covered the landscape, but it could not hide the reality of the situation. Humanly speaking, Gideon had every reason to be afraid. This detail is important because it reminds us of something the narrative has emphasized from the very beginning. Gideon has changed, but he has not become fearless. Too often, biblical heroes are remembered as larger-than-life figures who move from uncertainty to complete confidence. The actual text presents a far more realistic portrait. Gideon continues to struggle with fear even after receiving repeated confirmations from God. He has encountered the angel of the Lord. He has witnessed a miraculous sign involving his sacrifice. He has obeyed the command to destroy Baal's altar. He has experienced the empowerment of God's Spirit. He has received the signs of the fleece, yet fear remains. The biblical narrative does not hide this reality, because the story is not ultimately about the strength of Gideon's faith. It is about the patience of the God who continues to guide him. As night falls over the valley, God speaks once again. The message is both surprising and deeply personal. The Lord tells Gideon to go down against the Midianite camp because victory has been given into his hands. Then comes an extraordinary statement. If you are afraid to attack, take your servant Purah and go down to the camp. There you will hear something that will strengthen your hands. This moment reveals an important aspect of God's character within the narrative. God does not simply issue commands and demand immediate perfection. He acknowledges Gideon's fear and provides a means of encouragement. Rather than condemning him for his weakness, God meets him within that weakness. This pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout Gideon's journey, and now reaches another significant moment. Accompanied by Purah, Gideon quietly approaches the edge of the enemy camp. The scene is cinematic in its tension. Below them stretches one of the largest enemy forces Israel has faced during the period of the Judges. The biblical text once again emphasizes the immense size of the Midianite coalition. Their numbers are compared to swarms of locusts. Their camels are described as countless as the sand on the seashore. Such language is not intended to provide a precise census. Rather, it communicates how overwhelming the enemy appeared from an Israelite perspective. Standing at the edge of the camp, Gideon is confronted with visual proof of everything he fears. The enemy truly is enormous. The situation truly seems impossible. Yet what he hears next changes everything. Gideon arrives just as one Midianite soldier is describing a dream to his companion. The soldier recounts seeing a loaf of barley bread tumbling into the Midianite camp. The loaf strikes a tent with such force that the tent collapses completely. At first hearing, the dream sounds strange, almost absurd. Why would a loaf of bread become the central image in a military vision? To understand the symbolism, we must consider the cultural context. Barley was often regarded as a grain associated with poorer people. It was less prestigious than wheat and commonly consumed by those of lower economic status. In the context of the story, the loaf of barley likely symbolizes Israel itself. The nation has been impoverished by years of Midianite oppression. Israel appears weak, insignificant, and incapable of threatening a powerful enemy. Yet in the dream, this humble object becomes the instrument that destroys the tent, a symbol of the Midianite camp and its military power. What happens next is even more remarkable. The second soldier immediately interprets the dream. He declares that the loaf represents Gideon, son of Joash. God has given Midian and the entire camp into his hand. This response is extraordinary for several reasons. First, Gideon has not yet launched his attack. Second, the interpretation comes not from an Israelite prophet, but from a Midianite soldier. Third, it reveals that fear is already spreading within the enemy ranks. The battle has not begun, yet anxiety and uncertainty are present among those who seem strongest. From a literary perspective, this moment creates a dramatic reversal. Throughout the story, Gideon has been the fearful one. Now, for the first time, we discover that fear exists within the enemy camp as well. The Midianites are not as confident as they appear. Beneath their overwhelming numbers lies a growing sense of dread. In the ancient Near East, dreams often carried significant cultural and religious importance. Various civilizations, including Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Canaan, viewed dreams as potential channels of divine communication, whether interpreted through a theological lens or a historical one. The dream functions as a powerful narrative device. It provides confirmation from an unexpected source. Gideon does not receive another sign from Israel. He receives confirmation from the very people he is about to confront. The psychological impact must have been immense. Up to this point, every reassurance had come from God directly. Now, Gideon hears evidence that God is already at work within the enemy camp. Perhaps the most revealing part of the episode is Gideon's response. The text says that when he heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped. This is a significant moment of development in his character. Earlier chapters often showed Gideon asking questions, seeking confirmation, and struggling with uncertainty. Here, his first response is worship. before returning to his men, before preparing his strategy, before launching the attack, he acknowledges God. The emphasis remains where it has always belonged. The coming victory is not ultimately about Gideon's leadership or Israel's courage. It is about God's faithfulness. After worshiping, Gideon returns to the camp with a renewed sense of confidence. His words to the 300 are simple and direct. "Rise up. The Lord has given the camp of Midian into your hands." Notice the change in language. Earlier in the story, Gideon often spoke from a position of uncertainty. Now he speaks with conviction. The dream has not altered the size of the army. It has not reduced the number of enemy soldiers. Nothing has changed externally. Yet something has changed internally. Gideon now believes what God has been telling him all along. This chapter serves as a bridge between preparation and action. The signs are complete. The confirmations are finished. The moment of hesitation has passed. Soon, under the cover of darkness, 300 men carrying unusual weapons will descend upon one of the largest armies in the region. What follows will become one of the most famous victories in the entire Bible. But before the first trumpet sounds, the narrative pauses to remind us of a crucial truth. Long before God transformed the battlefield, He transformed the heart of the man He had chosen to lead. The night had finally arrived. Everything in Gideon's journey had been leading to this moment. The years of Midianite oppression, the call at the winepress, the destruction of Baal's altar, the signs of the fleece, the reduction of the army from 32,000 to 300, the dream in the enemy camp. Every event had been preparing for a confrontation that, from a purely military perspective, should never have happened. 300 men were about to face an enemy force so large that the biblical text compared it to a swarm of locusts. No experienced commander would have considered the situation favorable. No military analyst would have predicted success. Yet the battle that followed would become one of the most famous victories in all of biblical history, not because of superior strength, but because it overturned every expectation about how victory is normally achieved. After returning from the Midianite camp, Gideon immediately begins organizing his force. The strategy he adopts is unlike anything readers might expect. Instead of swords, shields, spears, or conventional military formations, the 300 men receive 3 unusual items. Each man carries a trumpet, an empty clay jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. At first glance, these objects appear completely inadequate for battle. A trumpet can make noise. A torch can provide light. A clay jar can hold a torch. None of these items are offensive weapons. The scene almost feels absurd. Yet that apparent absurdity is precisely what gives the narrative its power. Throughout the story, God has been systematically removing every source of human confidence. Now, even the battle plan itself seems designed to emphasize dependence upon divine intervention rather than military capability. Gideon divides the 300 men into 3 companies of 100 each. Under the cover of darkness, they move into position around the enemy camp. Timing is crucial. According to the text, they arrive at the beginning of the middle watch, a period during the night when many soldiers would be changing shifts. In the confusion of darkness, visibility is limited, awareness is reduced, and uncertainty can spread rapidly. Ancient armies depended heavily upon communication, discipline, and clear identification of friend and foe. Nighttime operations carried significant risks because confusion could easily turn into panic. Gideon's strategy appears designed to exploit these vulnerabilities. As the men take their positions, the tension becomes almost unbearable. Somewhere below them lies a massive enemy force. The Midianites are likely sleeping, resting, or maintaining limited watch rotations. They have no reason to expect an attack from a force of only 300 men. From their perspective, the numerical advantage remains overwhelming. Then the signal comes. Gideon and his men blow their trumpets. At the same moment, they smash their clay jars and reveal the blazing torches hidden inside. Suddenly, the darkness is shattered by light, noise, and confusion. Across the hills surrounding the camp, hundreds of torches appear simultaneously. Trumpets echo through the night. The men shout, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" And to understand the impact of this moment, it is important to consider the military customs of the ancient world. In many armies, a trumpet was typically carried by an officer or designated signal bearer, rather than by every individual soldier. If hundreds of trumpets sounded at once, listeners might reasonably assume that an enormous army was approaching. Combined with the sudden appearance of lights surrounding the camp, the effect would have been psychologically devastating. The Midianites are awakened by what appears to be a large-scale surprise attack. Confusion spreads rapidly. Darkness prevents accurate assessment of the situation. Fear amplifies uncertainty. The result is chaos. Judges chapter 7 reports that the Lord caused the Midianites to turn their swords against one another. In the panic and disorder, the enemy begins fighting itself. This detail is one of the most significant elements of the narrative. The decisive blow does not come from Gideon's 300. It comes from the collapse of order within the Midianite camp. The enemy's greatest strength, its vast numbers, becomes a liability. Large groups operating in darkness and confusion can quickly become dangerous to themselves. What follows is a complete rout. The Midianites flee. Their coalition breaks apart. The army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years suddenly collapses under the weight of fear and disorganization. Gideon's men pursue the fleeing enemy, while additional Israelite forces are called to join the effort. The battle that seemed impossible ends in overwhelming success. Yet, one of the most fascinating aspects of the story is what it does not emphasize. The narrative does not spend much time describing heroic combat by the 300. It does not celebrate individual acts of military brilliance. Instead, the focus remains on the extraordinary way in which the victory occurs. This is consistent with the theological purpose established earlier in the story. God reduced the army precisely so that Israel could not claim the victory for itself. The battle unfolds in a manner that continually directs attention away from human strength and toward divine action. Historically and academically, interpretations of this event vary. Some scholars view the account primarily as a theological narrative, emphasizing God's intervention in history. Others have explored possible military and psychological factors that may have contributed to the outcome. Ancient warfare was often influenced by morale, surprise, communication failures, and panic. A sudden nighttime disturbance could indeed create confusion within a large camp. Yet, regardless of how one approaches the historical details, the biblical author's intention remains clear. The story is constructed to demonstrate that Israel's deliverance cannot be explained solely by conventional military logic. The deeper message concerns trust, dependence, and the unexpected ways in which God works through apparent weakness. There is also a profound irony at the heart of the narrative. At the beginning of Gideon's story, fear belonged almost entirely to Israel. Farmers hid their grain. Families lived in caves. Entire communities existed under the shadow of Midianite power. Now the roles have been reversed. Fear has moved into the enemy camp. The same anxiety that once paralyzed Israel now overwhelms the oppressors. The reversal is so complete that the seemingly invincible army becomes incapable of functioning as a unified force. For Gideon personally, this victory marks the fulfillment of the calling he received beneath the oak tree in Ophrah. The man who once questioned whether God was truly with Israel has now witnessed the answer with his own eyes. The promises made during that first encounter have become reality, yet the story is not over. In fact, some of the most revealing chapters of Gideon's life still lie ahead. Defeating Midian's army is one thing. Dealing with the aftermath of victory is another. History repeatedly shows that success can test a leader just as severely as failure. And as Gideon moves from battlefield triumph to political influence, new challenges begin to emerge that will expose dimensions of his character not yet seen. The battle may be won, but the larger story of Gideon is far from finished. The dramatic victory of the 300 is often remembered as the climax of Gideon's story. In many retellings, the narrative effectively ends the moment the Midianite camp collapses into panic and the enemy begins to flee. Yet, the biblical account continues for an entire chapter after the famous battle. In fact, some of the most revealing moments in Gideon's life occur not during the miraculous victory itself, but during the difficult pursuit that follows. The battlefield triumph may have broken the power of Midian's army, but the mission was not yet complete. Key leaders remained alive, and as long as they escaped, the threat to Israel would continue. The next phase of the story shifts from dramatic divine intervention to the complex realities of leadership, politics, justice, and human character. As the Midianites flee eastward across the Jordan River, Gideon acts quickly. Messages are sent throughout the surrounding tribes, particularly to Ephraim, calling additional warriors into action. The goal is clear. The fleeing enemy must not be allowed to regroup. Strategic crossings along the Jordan must be secured. Escape routes must be blocked. This response demonstrates an important aspect of Gideon's leadership that is sometimes overlooked. While the miraculous victory receives most of the attention, Gideon also proves capable of making practical military decisions. The narrative consistently presents both divine action and human responsibility working together. God grants victory, but Gideon still has to lead. The tribe of Ephraim responds effectively and captures two important Midianite commanders, Oreb and Zeb. Their names become associated with locations where they are executed, preserving the memory of the victory. Yet, what follows reveals an emerging tension within Israel itself. Rather than celebrating the defeat of a common enemy, the Ephraimites confront Gideon with a complaint. They are angry because they were not invited to participate from the beginning of the campaign. At first glance, the complaint may seem petty. Israel has just experienced one of the most significant victories in its recent history. Yet, the reaction reflects deeper realities within the tribal structure of ancient Israel. During the period of the Judges, tribal identity remained extremely important. Questions of honor, prestige, and influence often shaped political relationships. Ephraim was one of the most prominent tribes in Israel, and its members may have felt insulted by their perceived exclusion from the early stages of the campaign. Gideon's response is surprisingly diplomatic. Rather than escalating the conflict, he praises Ephraim's accomplishments. He points out that their capture of Oreb and Zeb exceeds what he himself has achieved. The strategy works. Their anger subsides. This episode offers a glimpse into a side of Gideon that has not been fully visible before. He is not merely a military leader. He is also learning to navigate the fragile political realities of a divided nation. Leadership involves more than defeating external enemies. It also requires managing internal tensions. Yet, even as this dispute is resolved, a far more difficult challenge lies ahead. Gideon and his 300 men continue pursuing the Midianite king Zebah and Zalmunna. By this stage, the pursuit has become physically exhausting. The text specifically notes that the men are weary but still pursuing. This brief phrase carries significant weight. The victory in the valley did not instantly eliminate hardship. Gideon's force remains small. They are operating far from home. They are crossing difficult terrain. They are chasing an enemy that is still dangerous despite recent losses. Success has not removed the need for perseverance. During the pursuit, Gideon arrives at the Israelite town of Sukkoth and requests food for his exhausted men. The request seems entirely reasonable. These warriors are risking their lives in a campaign that benefits the entire nation. Yet the leaders of Sukkoth refuse. Their reasoning reveals their fear. They ask whether Gideon has already captured Zebah and Zalmunna. If not, why should they risk supporting him? Their concern is understandable from a human perspective. If Gideon fails and the Midianite kings survive, anyone who aided him could face retaliation. Sukkoth chooses caution over commitment. Gideon responds with a warning. When victory is complete, he promises to return and punish the town. Continuing eastward, he encounters a similar refusal from the town of Penuel. Once again, support is denied. Once again, fear overrides solidarity. Gideon responds with another promise of future judgment. These incidents introduce one of the more controversial aspects of Gideon's story. Earlier chapters emphasized his humility, uncertainty, and dependence upon God. Now we begin to see a harder edge emerging. Some scholars view these events as evidence of increasing confidence. Others suggest they reveal the beginnings of a more troubling transformation. The text itself presents the events without extensive commentary, allowing readers to wrestle with their implications. Eventually, Gideon catches up with Zebah and Zalmunna. Despite the losses suffered by their army, the two kings remain alive and continue moving eastward with a surviving force. Gideon launches a surprise attack and captures them. With their capture, the military threat that had dominated Israel for 7 years is finally broken. Yet the narrative does not move immediately to celebration. Instead, Gideon begins questioning the captured kings about a previous incident. He asks about men they killed at Tabor. The kings admit responsibility and describe the victims as resembling Gideon himself. At this point, the story reveals a deeply personal dimension to the conflict. The murdered men were Gideon's brothers. What appeared to be a national struggle against oppression also contains an element of family tragedy. The war is not merely political, it is personal. Gideon now seeks justice for the deaths of his brothers. He initially instructs his young son Jether to execute the kings. However, Jether hesitates, likely because of his youth and inexperience. The kings themselves challenge Gideon to perform the act personally, arguing that a man's strength is demonstrated through his own actions. Gideon then kills Zebah and Zalmunna. Modern readers often find this scene uncomfortable, and it certainly differs from contemporary expectations regarding warfare and justice. Within the context of the ancient Near East, however, the execution of defeated rulers responsible for violence and oppression was not unusual. The narrative does not present the event primarily as an act of revenge. Rather, it reflects the realities of leadership, justice, and accountability within its historical setting. Nevertheless, the episode contributes to the increasingly complex portrait of Gideon. He is no longer the hesitant man hiding in a wine press. He has become a commander capable of making difficult and sometimes harsh decisions. By the end of the chapter, the Midianite kings are dead. The enemy coalition has been shattered. Israel's long nightmare is finally over. Yet the story is beginning to move in a new direction. The military campaign has transformed Gideon's position within society. He is no longer an obscure farmer from a minor clan. He is now the most celebrated figure in Israel. The question that remains is, what happens when a reluctant deliverer suddenly becomes a national hero? History has shown countless times that victory can create temptations every bit as dangerous as defeat. and the next chapter will reveal how Gideon responds when the people offer him something that no judge before him had ever been offered before. By the time Gideon returned from the campaign against Midian, he had become something Israel had not seen in generations. He was a national hero. The man who once doubted his own abilities had led one of the most astonishing victories in Israel's history. The enemy that had terrorized the land for 7 years had been defeated. The Midianite kings were dead. Trade routes could reopen. Farmers could return to their fields. Families could once again live without the constant fear of invasion. For many Israelites, Gideon was more than a successful military leader. He was the man who had restored hope to a broken nation. Yet, as the dust of victory settled, a new challenge emerged. Unlike the Midianites, this challenge would not come from outside Israel. It would arise from within the people themselves. And in many ways, it would become one of the most significant moments in Gideon's entire story. The people approach Gideon with an extraordinary request. They ask him to rule over them, not only him, but also his son and his grandson after him. In other words, they are not simply offering him a position of leadership. They are proposing the foundation of a hereditary dynasty. This is one of the earliest moments in the Bible where something resembling kingship is openly suggested within Israel. To modern readers, the request may seem understandable. Throughout history, successful military leaders have often become political rulers. When a nation experiences crisis and uncertainty, people frequently seek stability through strong leadership. Gideon had proven himself on the battlefield. He had united tribes that often struggled to cooperate. He had delivered Israel from oppression, from a human perspective. He appeared to be the ideal candidate for permanent national leadership. Yet, the request reveals something deeper about Israel's condition. Throughout the Book of Judges, one recurring problem has been instability. The tribes lacked centralized authority. Different regions often acted independently. Political unity was fragile. In the aftermath of Gideon's victory, many Israelites seem to conclude that what the nation truly needs is a king. They are looking for a human solution to a recurring national problem. The irony is that this request emerges immediately after a story designed to demonstrate God's direct involvement in Israel's deliverance. The victory over Midian was specifically structured so that no one could claim credit for it. The army was reduced. The battle plan defied military logic. The enemy destroyed itself in confusion. Every element of the narrative pointed beyond human leadership toward divine action. Yet now the people focus their attention on Gideon. The deliverer begins to overshadow the deliverer. This is why Gideon's response is so important. He refuses the offer. His words become one of the most significant theological statements in the entire Book of Judges. I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. At first glance, the statement appears to represent a perfect conclusion to Gideon's story. The reluctant leader who once struggled with fear now demonstrates remarkable humility. He rejects personal power and directs the people's attention back to God. Many scholars consider this one of the high points of Gideon's character. He understands something essential about Israel's identity. Unlike surrounding nations, Israel was never intended to function primarily as a conventional monarchy. According to the covenant tradition, God himself was Israel's true king. Human leaders were meant to serve under divine authority, not replace it. Gideon's refusal appears to affirm this principle. Historically, this moment also anticipates later debates within Israel regarding kingship. Centuries after Gideon, the nation would formally request a king during the time of Samuel. The issues raised in that later narrative echo many of the themes already visible here. Questions about authority, trust, leadership, and dependence upon God continue to shape Israel's story. Gideon's response therefore functions not only as a personal decision, but also as a theological statement about the nature of Israel's relationship with God. Yet, as compelling as Gideon's words are, careful readers quickly notice a tension emerging beneath the surface. The narrative begins presenting details that complicate the picture. Although Gideon refuses the title of king, some of his later actions resemble royal behavior. This tension has fascinated biblical scholars for centuries. On one hand, Gideon explicitly rejects kingship. On the other hand, certain aspects of his lifestyle begin reflecting the privileges and influence normally associated with royal status. The first indication comes immediately after his refusal. Gideon asks the people for a contribution from the spoils of war. Specifically, he requests the gold earrings taken from the defeated Midianites. The request itself is not necessarily unusual. Victorious leaders in the ancient Near East often received portions of captured wealth. The people willingly comply, spreading out a garment and contributing large quantities of gold. The total becomes substantial. The narrative does not initially present this development as problematic. However, the collection of wealth begins creating a new dynamic around Gideon. The humble farmer from Ophrah now possesses resources, influence, and prestige unlike anything he previously knew. The challenge of leadership often changes once victory is achieved. During times of crisis, dependence upon God can feel urgent and obvious. Success introduces different temptations. Power, recognition, wealth, and public admiration create pressures that are often more subtle than fear or hardship. Gideon's story is beginning to move into this new phase. Another detail further reinforces this transition. The people continue treating Gideon with extraordinary honor. His authority is widely recognized. His influence extends far beyond his original clan. In practical terms, he becomes one of the most powerful individuals in Israel, even without formally accepting the title of king. This creates an important question that hovers over the remainder of the narrative. Is it possible to reject a crown while still embracing many of the benefits associated with it? The text does not immediately answer that question. Instead, it allows the tension to develop gradually. From a literary perspective, this moment serves as a turning point in Gideon's character arc. Earlier chapters focused on weakness, uncertainty, and dependence. Gideon needed reassurance at nearly every stage of his calling. Now, the circumstances have changed completely. He has succeeded. He is respected. He is celebrated. The nation admires him. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that success often reveals aspects of character that failure never exposes. Many leaders handle adversity better than prosperity. Many individuals who remain humble in struggle become vulnerable in victory. The Book of Judges understands this reality well. As this chapter closes, Gideon appears to have made the right decision. His refusal of kingship stands as one of the most admirable moments in his story. Yet, beneath the surface, new questions are beginning to emerge. The military conflict with Midian has ended, but a different kind of test is now beginning. It is a test not of fear, but of success, not of weakness, but of influence. And the choices Gideon makes next will shape not only his own future, but the future of his family and the nation he has just delivered. If Gideon's story ended with his refusal of kingship, it would be remembered as one of the most inspiring leadership narratives in the entire Bible. A fearful man called by God rises to deliver his people, defeats a powerful enemy through divine intervention, and then humbly rejects political power in order to affirm God's authority over the nation. It would be a nearly perfect ending. Yet, one of the most remarkable characteristics of the biblical text is its willingness to complicate its heroes. Unlike many ancient legends that idealize their central figures, the Bible often presents its leaders with uncomfortable honesty. Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, and many others are shown with both strengths and weaknesses. Gideon is no exception. In fact, the story now enters one of its most debated and misunderstood sections. What happens next does not erase Gideon's achievements, but it introduces a troubling development that casts a shadow over the closing years of his life. After collecting the gold earrings from the people, Gideon uses the material to create an ephod. At first glance, modern readers may struggle to understand why this is significant. The word ephod appears in several places throughout the Old Testament and can refer to different objects depending on the context. Most commonly, an ephod was a priestly garment associated with worship and divine consultation. It was connected to the religious life of Israel, and particularly to the ministry of the high priest. However, the exact nature of the ephod created by Gideon remains one of the most discussed questions among biblical scholars. The text itself provides only limited details. We are told that Gideon fashions an ephod from the gold and places it in his hometown of Ophrah. What precisely did this object look like? Was it a garment, a ceremonial artifact, a cultic image, or some combination of these elements? Scholars disagree. Some argue that it functioned as a priestly object intended to facilitate worship. Others suggest it may have become a symbolic representation of religious authority. A few have even proposed that it resembled an image or shrine associated with sacred practices, because the evidence is limited. Certainty is impossible. What matters most, however, is not the exact physical appearance of the ephod. What matters is the effect it produced. The biblical author tells us that all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. This statement leaves little doubt regarding the outcome. Whatever Gideon's intentions may have been, the ephod became a spiritual problem rather than a spiritual blessing. The wording is particularly striking because it echoes earlier themes throughout the Book of Judges. Israel's recurring downfall has repeatedly involved misplaced worship and divided loyalty. The nation struggles to remain faithful to God alone. Now, unexpectedly, a new source of spiritual confusion emerges not from a pagan nation or a foreign idol, but from the legacy of Israel's own deliverer. This development raises a difficult question. Why would Gideon create such an object in the first place? The text does not explicitly explain his motives, which has led to considerable debate. Some scholars believe Gideon may have intended to establish a local center for worship. Others suggest he may have viewed the ephod as a memorial commemorating God's victory over Midian. Another possibility is that Gideon desired a means of seeking divine guidance outside the centralized priestly structures. Whatever his motivation, the narrative focuses less on intention and more on consequence. Good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. This theme appears repeatedly throughout Scripture. Actions that begin with noble purposes can still produce unintended and destructive results. There is a profound irony at the heart of this episode. Earlier in the story, Gideon courageously destroyed his father's altar to Baal. He confronted idolatry within his community and risked his life to restore proper worship. Now, years later, something associated with Gideon himself becomes a source of spiritual stumbling. The man who once tore down a false center of worship inadvertently creates another one. The contrast is difficult to ignore. It serves as a reminder that spiritual dangers do not disappear simply because a person has experienced past victories. In many ways, the temptation created by success can be more subtle than the temptations encountered during hardship. During the years of oppression, Gideon depended heavily upon God. During the years of influence and prosperity, new challenges emerged. The narrative also invites reflection on the nature of leadership and legacy. Leaders often have far greater influence than they realize. Their decisions shape communities, institutions, and future generations. Gideon may never have intended the ephod to become an object of misplaced devotion. Yet once established, it acquired a significance beyond his control. This dynamic is visible throughout history. Religious movements, political systems, and cultural traditions frequently evolve in directions their founders never anticipated. The consequences of leadership often extend far beyond original intentions. Another revealing detail appears in the broader description of Gideon's later life. Following the defeat of Midian, the land enjoys peace for 40 years. This period of stability reflects the success of Gideon's leadership. Unlike many judges whose influence was relatively brief, Gideon presides over decades of security. Yet, the narrative subtly juxtaposes this external peace with growing internal concerns. Outwardly, Israel appears stable. Inwardly, problems are developing beneath the surface. The ephod becomes a symbol of this tension. The nation is no longer threatened by Midian, but spiritual confusion continues to linger. Some interpreters have argued that the ephod episode represents one of the central lessons of Gideon's story. The greatest threats to faith are not always obvious enemies. Sometimes they emerge through respected leaders, familiar traditions, or seemingly harmless innovations. The danger lies not merely in open rebellion against God, but in subtle shifts of trust and devotion. The Book of Judges consistently emphasizes that covenant faithfulness requires ongoing vigilance. No past victory guarantees future faithfulness. Theologically, the episode also reinforces a broader biblical principle. Human deliverers, no matter how gifted or successful, remain imperfect. Gideon was used by God in extraordinary ways. His calling was genuine. His achievements were real. His courage changed the course of Israel's history. Yet, he remained a flawed individual, capable of making serious mistakes. The story refuses to allow readers to place ultimate confidence in human leaders. That role belongs to God alone. As the chapter moves toward its conclusion, Gideon's reputation remains largely positive. The nation remembers his victories. The land enjoys peace. His influence is immense. Yet, a shadow now hangs over his legacy. The ephod has become a snare. Spiritual problems are quietly taking root beneath the surface. The consequences are not immediately visible, but they are already beginning to shape the future. And when Gideon eventually dies, those hidden problems will erupt in ways far more destructive than anyone could have imagined. The story that began with the deliverance of Israel is about to become a story about the collapse of a legacy. For 40 years after the defeat of Midian, the land enjoyed peace. From a distance, Gideon's story appeared to have ended successfully. Israel had been delivered. A powerful enemy had been defeated. A generation had grown up without experiencing the terror of Midianite raids. Gideon himself had become one of the most respected figures of the era. If history had stopped there, his legacy would likely have been remembered almost entirely as a triumph. Yet the Book of Judges rarely offers such simple conclusions. Again and again, the narrative reveals that the true impact of leadership is often measured not only by what happens during a person's lifetime, but by what unfolds after they are gone. In Gideon's case, the most tragic chapter of his story begins after his death. The warning signs had already appeared. Gideon refused the title of king, yet many aspects of his later life reflected an increasingly royal status. The biblical text notes that he had many wives and 70 sons. In the ancient Near East, large households and numerous offspring were often associated with wealth, influence, and prestige. Gideon may never have officially accepted a crown, but he lived with a level of authority that few others in Israel possessed. Among his children was a son named Abimelech. born to a concubine from the city of Shechem. The significance of this detail becomes clear only later. The name Abimelech is particularly interesting. In Hebrew, it can be understood as meaning, "My father is king," or "father of a king." Scholars have long noted the irony. Gideon publicly rejected kingship. Yet, one of his sons bears a name closely associated with royal authority. Whether the name reflects Gideon's intentions, the mother's ambitions, or broader cultural expectations remains uncertain. What is clear is that the tension surrounding kingship never fully disappeared from his household. When Gideon dies, the situation changes rapidly. The biblical text immediately notes that Israel once again turns away from the Lord and returns to the worship of Baal. This observation connects the coming crisis to one of the major themes of the Book of Judges. The cycle has begun again. Deliverance led to peace. Peace led to forgetfulness. Forgetfulness led to spiritual decline. The people who had witnessed God's faithfulness through Gideon quickly abandoned their covenant commitments. Even more striking is the statement that they failed to show loyalty to Gideon's family, despite all he had done for Israel. Gratitude proves surprisingly short-lived. Into this environment steps Abimelech. Unlike his father, Abimelech is not presented as a reluctant leader. He displays none of Gideon's hesitation, none of his uncertainty, and none of his dependence upon divine guidance. Instead, he emerges as a figure driven by ambition. He travels to Shechem, the city connected to his mother's family, and begins building political support. His argument is simple and persuasive. Would it be better, he asks, for 70 sons of Gideon to rule over you, or for one man to rule? Then he reminds them of their shared blood relationship. The appeal is both political and personal. Abimelech is positioning himself as the logical choice for leadership. The leaders of Shechem respond favorably. They provide him with silver, taken from the temple of Baal Berith. The source of the money is significant. Earlier chapters showed Gideon confronting idolatry and destroying Baal's altar. Now, the resources used to establish Abimelech's power come directly from a pagan religious center. The contrast could hardly be more dramatic. With this money, Abimelech hires reckless and violent men to support his cause. What follows is one of the darkest episodes in the entire Book of Judges. Abimelech travels to Ophrah, the hometown of Gideon, and murders his brothers. 70 sons of Gideon are executed on a single stone. The image is horrifying. The family that once symbolized deliverance and hope is nearly wiped out by one of its own members. The violence is not accidental or impulsive. It is calculated. Abimelech understands that his brothers represent potential rivals. Eliminating them secures his path to power. Yet one son survives. Jotham, the youngest, manages to escape. His survival proves crucial because he becomes the lone voice willing to confront the injustice that has occurred. After Abimelech is proclaimed king by the people of Shechem, Jotham climbs Mount Gerizim and delivers one of the most remarkable speeches in the Old Testament. He tells a parable about trees seeking a king. In the story, the olive tree refuses, the fig tree refuses, the vine refuses. Eventually, the trees turn to a thorn bush, which eagerly accepts the offer. The symbolism is powerful. Productive and beneficial trees decline the pursuit of power. The worthless thorn bush embraces it. Most scholars interpret the parable as a direct critique of Abimelech. He is the thorn bush, a leader whose ambition exceeds his worthiness. Jotham then pronounces a warning. If the actions of Shechem and Abimelech have been honorable, let them enjoy peace. If not, destruction will come upon both sides. The speech introduces a theme that dominates the remainder of the narrative. Political power obtained through violence rarely produces stability. The seeds of destruction are already present within Abimelech's kingdom. For a time, however, he appears successful. He rules for 3 years. Yet beneath the surface, tensions begin to grow. Distrust emerges between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem. Alliances weaken. Rivalries intensify. Eventually, open conflict erupts. The same people who helped elevate Abimelech now turn against him. What follows is a cycle of betrayal, violence, and revenge. Towns are attacked. Citizens are killed. Entire communities suffer, as political ambition consumes everything around it. The climax arrives when Abimelech attacks the city of Thebez. As he approaches a fortified tower, a woman drops a millstone from above. The stone strikes Abimelech's head and crushes his skull. Mortally wounded, he quickly orders his armor-bearer to kill him so that people will not say he died at the hand of a woman. The irony is unavoidable. The man who murdered 70 brothers to secure power dies not in glory, but in humiliation. His kingdom collapses almost immediately. The biblical author then provides an explicit interpretation. God repaid the wickedness Abimelech had committed against his father by murdering his brothers. The violence he unleashed eventually returned upon his own head. From a narrative perspective, the story of Abimelech serves as the final shadow hanging over Gideon's legacy. The deliverer who saved Israel from Midian left behind a family that became entangled in ambition, violence, and political chaos. Yet, it would be unfair to reduce Gideon's entire legacy to Abimelech's crimes. The Book of Judges presents a more complex picture. Gideon was genuinely used by God. His faith mattered. His obedience changed history. Yet his story also demonstrates how the consequences of leadership can extend far beyond a single lifetime. The choices leaders make shape environments that future generations inherit. Some of those influences produce blessing. Others create dangers that remain hidden until much later. By the end of Abimelech's story, the reader is left with a sobering realization. Gideon's greatest battle may not have been against Midian at all. It may have been the challenge of leaving behind a legacy capable of surviving after his death. And that question leads directly into the final chapter, where we must step back and ask what the complete story of Gideon actually teaches us. As we reach the end of Gideon's story, it becomes clear that this narrative is far more complex than many people realize. For generations, Gideon has often been remembered primarily as the leader of the 300, the man who defeated a vast army against impossible odds. That part of the story is certainly important. It remains one of the most dramatic accounts in the entire Old Testament. Yet, if that is all we remember, we miss much of what the biblical author was actually trying to communicate. The complete story of Gideon is not simply about military victory. It is about fear and faith, weakness and strength, success and failure, leadership and legacy. Most importantly, it is about the relationship between God's faithfulness and human imperfection. One of the first lessons that emerges from Gideon's life is that God often works through unlikely people. When Gideon first appears, there is little to suggest that he will become Israel's deliverer. He is hiding in a winepress. He is afraid of the Midianites. He questions God's presence. He repeatedly asks for reassurance. In many modern leadership stories, heroes are introduced with exceptional qualities that set them apart from everyone else. Gideon's story moves in the opposite direction. The narrative deliberately emphasizes his weakness. The point is not that Gideon possessed hidden greatness waiting to be discovered. The point is that God chose to work through someone who understood his own limitations. Throughout Scripture, this pattern appears repeatedly. Abraham was elderly. Moses was reluctant. David was the youngest son in his family. Jeremiah felt too young for his calling. The biblical tradition consistently challenges the assumption that God primarily uses the strongest, most impressive, or most qualified individuals. Gideon stands firmly within that tradition. Yet the story also teaches something important about faith itself. Popular retellings sometimes portray Gideon as a model of unshakable confidence. The actual text presents a more nuanced picture. Gideon's faith develops gradually. He asks difficult questions. He seeks confirmation. He struggles with fear even after receiving multiple signs. The narrative never hides these realities. Instead, it reveals a God who patiently guides a reluctant leader step by step. This is one of the most encouraging aspects of the story. Gideon's usefulness does not depend upon perfect confidence. God works with him in the midst of uncertainty. The emphasis falls not on the strength of Gideon's faith, but on the faithfulness of God. Another major lesson concerns the true nature of Israel's crisis. At first glance, the Midianites appear to be the central problem. They destroy crops, terrorize communities, and dominate the land. Yet, the narrative repeatedly insists that the deeper issue is spiritual rather than military. Before Gideon fights Midian, he must tear down Baal's altar. Before external deliverance can occur, internal corruption must be confronted. This theme remains relevant throughout the Book of Judges. The greatest dangers facing Israel are not always foreign armies. They are often misplaced loyalties, compromised worship, and forgotten covenant commitments. The story, therefore, challenges readers to look beyond visible problems and consider deeper causes. Gideon's victory with 300 men also carries a lesson that extends far beyond the battlefield. The reduction of the army was designed to remove every obvious source of human confidence. The narrative intentionally creates a situation where success appears impossible. In doing so, it reinforces one of the central theological themes of the Old Testament. Human strength is not the ultimate source of deliverance. Time and again, Scripture portrays God accomplishing His purposes through circumstances that seem weak, unlikely, or inadequate. The 300 become a symbol of dependence. Their victory is not presented as proof of human potential, but as evidence of divine faithfulness. Yet, perhaps the most surprising lesson emerges in the final chapters of Gideon's life. Many stories would end with the defeat of Midian. The Bible does not. Instead, it continues into the uncomfortable territory of success, influence, and legacy. This is where Gideon's story becomes particularly realistic. Human beings often assume that the greatest tests occur during hardship. The Book of Judges suggests that success can be equally dangerous. Gideon passes many difficult tests when he is weak, fearful, and dependent upon God. Later, after achieving victory and receiving public admiration, new challenges emerge. The ephod becomes a snare. His household grows increasingly complex. Ambitions and unintended consequences begin shaping the next generation. These developments do not erase Gideon's achievements, but they remind readers that spiritual maturity requires ongoing vigilance. No past victory guarantees future faithfulness. The story of Abimelech reinforces this lesson even further. Gideon's son inherits influence without inheriting character. He seeks power without seeking wisdom. He pursues authority without embracing responsibility. The result is violence, betrayal, and destruction through Abimelech. The narrative demonstrates that leadership is never merely about achieving success in the present. It is also about shaping the future. Legacies are fragile. They can be strengthened by humility and faithfulness, or undermined by pride, ambition, and compromise. One of the most remarkable features of the Gideon narrative is its honesty. The Bible does not turn Gideon into a flawless hero. It allows readers to see both his courage and his weaknesses. It celebrates his obedience while acknowledging his mistakes. This balance is important because it prevents the story from becoming a simple tale of hero worship. Ultimately, Gideon is not the hero of the narrative. God is. Gideon serves as an instrument through whom God's purposes are accomplished. His life points beyond himself toward the God who called him, strengthened him, and worked through him despite his imperfections. From a historical perspective, Gideon's story also provides valuable insight into the world of ancient Israel during the period of the Judges. It reflects a society struggling with tribal divisions, political instability, economic vulnerability, and competing religious influences. The narrative emerges from a real historical context, shaped by the challenges of life in the ancient Near East. While scholars continue to debate specific details regarding chronology, archaeology, and historical reconstruction, the story remains one of the most important windows into how ancient Israel understood its relationship with God, leadership, and national identity. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of all is that Gideon's story is not ultimately about extraordinary people. It is about an extraordinary God working through ordinary people. The man who began his journey hiding in a winepress never became perfect. He remained a complex and deeply human figure. He experienced doubt. He required reassurance. He made mistakes. He left behind both triumphs and problems. Yet despite all of that, God used him to change the course of Israel's history. That reality lies at the heart of the narrative. The complete story of Gideon does not invite us to admire human greatness. It invites us to recognize divine faithfulness in the midst of human weakness. And that may be why, thousands of years later, the story continues to resonate with readers around the world, because Gideon's struggles feel familiar. His fears feel real. His failures feel understandable. And his journey reminds us that God's purposes are often accomplished not through perfect people, but through imperfect people willing to respond when they are called.